you've got an incredible program put together, and I just want to thank you so much for being here. I know that this is a really stressful time for a lot of you, and I know that there's a lot of questions. I know there's a lot of concerns, and I know that you've got a lot of nervousness about this transition and everything going on with how we're going to be working through this new landscape. A couple of ground rules before we get started. Number one, I just want to make sure that, let's see, I'm getting a message that I've got some echo. Let me see if I can cut that out for just a second. Let's see if I change this to... Is that better? Let's see, is that better? Diana, is that better on the echo? Hopefully. Let's see. What was I saying? I forgot. Never mind. We're back. A couple of ground rules. Number one, let's be patient and considerate in our interactions. Let's make sure that I know that there's a lot of frustration and there's a lot of questions about why and how and a lot of these things. And I want to make sure that we have everything set just right. I'm so sorry. I'm still getting some messages about some echo. Let me change one more setting and see if that does it. Let's see. I want to make sure that we get all of this just right. All right, let's try that. If that's better, let me take these out and we're going to just go it without earbuds. How about that? Okay, back to what we were saying. Diana, echo? No echo? Hopefully we're all good. Let me get back into this. Great. Awesome. Okay, so what I was saying was being kind, being considerate, being patient in all these conversations. We want to make sure that we're handling everything just right. Be good to our staff. They are working so hard to equip you folks to answer questions. We've got our entire broker team here answering questions in the chat. We want to make sure that you don't have to wait and maybe forget the question later while it's still relevant. Go ahead and ask it right now. And if our team needs to kind of get a little bit of further background or explore some answers or options a little bit more, we'll come back to those questions near the end. But we're going to try to get through this as much as we can in real time. We're going to try to help you guys as much as we can. Another thing I want to say about this is there is no big bad wolf. This is not about somebody coming to steal your commissions or to just ruin the industry. That's not what this is about. I want to be really clear about that. Blaming and finger pointing and all that kind of stuff is not going to be very helpful right now. All of that energy is going to really be better served digging into understanding how to move forward. There are bad actors in every industry, period. And there are bad actors in the real estate industry. It just happens. We're not immune. But to be clear about the nature of these changes, at the heart of it, I believe everything boils down to, number one, unclear communication in the past. We haven't been good, and when I say we, I mean the industry in general. We haven't been really good about communicating not only our value proposition, and that's something that we've probably heard a million times at this point, but also communicating the nuances of how some of these things in our industry work. We've been sometimes very vague in describing things. And I know that a lot of us have used language on Facebook like, hey, if you're a buyer, I work for free for you. We can't say that because ultimately we don't work for free. And we want to make sure we're being clear and we're being transparent with all of our communication. So unclear communication, I think, is a huge culprit in the background that brought this to be where we are right now. Number two, unclear practices. We've been saying for years, have those conversations with your buyers, have those conversations about the buyer rep agreement, talk to them about the language in this. And honestly, these are the things that a lot of times we should have been doing all along. So we want to be clear, we want to be transparent, we want to be open in our conversations, and we're going to equip you to do just that today. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to elevate and not escalate. We're going to elevate the conversation, we're going to elevate our industry, and we're not going to escalate tension. We're going to diffuse tension. We're not going to escalate insecurity or uncertainty. We want to diffuse that. We want to bring answers and clarity. We're going to elevate. Also, and this is really clear for moving forward, not just here today, but moving forward in our industry, period. We've got to stop looking for workarounds. All those Facebook groups, all those places that we see people talk about ways to get around the whole 3% or whatever percent. There are no workarounds. There's no way to get around this. We have to have the hard conversations. So I want us to commit today to being willing to have those hard conversations. And we're going to talk through how to have those. So one last thing I want to keep in mind today. In about a month to 2 months, maybe 3 tops, we're going to start seeing licensees enter into a real estate world where they won't know any other way to be than this new landscape. And that is such a huge thing on all fronts. We're entering a world where the next licensees, there's not going to be any other way of doing business than this way. So we're going to have to learn in real time, right now, this morning, today, to help teach those agents how to really do it well. One of my favorite quotes of all is a quote by Abraham Maslow, a famous, behavioral psychologist, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We all know that kind of thing. But my favorite quote from him was you can either step forward into growth or back into safety. Those are our 2 options today. We can step forward into growth or back into safety. And I'm choosing growth, and I know we all are choosing growth this morning. So right now, I want to go ahead and bring out Mary Miner. She's an incredible person. I've gotten to know her over the last 6 to 8 weeks or so, and I adore Mary. She's an incredible instructor. She's on the TREC Broker Lawyer Committee. And I'm going to go ahead and bring her out right now. Mary, thank you so much for joining us. Let's go ahead and unmute that mic and talk to us a little bit about what the Broker Lawyer Committee does and how we kind of got to this place in time.
Well, welcome and good morning. A little bit about what's going on, and the thing that you've got to understand with the Broker Lawyer Committee, we are all governed by legislation, and we only make the changes on the actual 1 to 4 contracts or the actual promulgated contracts. So what you're going to see today is you're going to talk about the forms and stuff, which the Texas Association of Realtors has put together to help with that, because contracts don't change fast. We are legislation. We are governed by legislation. So once we see that there's an issue or we need to change a contract and or any of the promulgated contracts, it then goes back to the commission once we send our ideas. Once they get that, they will then send it out to all of you, all 140,000 real estate agents, not just realtors, and ask for public comment. So it's out for public comment for 30 days, and then it comes back to the Broker Lawyer Committee. We sort of do we look at all the comments, we do what we have to do, and it goes back to the commission. With that being said, everything's being sent to the commission in August. They will then put it out for public comment. So here's your job. Your job is to, when you're on the TREC website, is to go out and do public comment. I have this saying, don't complain unless you actually look at it and you actually will give some ideas. We're looking for that. But the last time we did public comment, we got 500 comments. 40,000 plus real estate agents in Texas, and we got 500 comments. So I encourage all of you. Once it gets out of that, it'll go to commission. So in our case, if there is a change in the contract, because I don't know until it gets all the way through the whole process, you will not see a new contract until at least January. So with that being said, that's why Texas Realtors has gone and created all these forms to help us with our profession and to actually keep us rolling the way we need because of what's going on with the settlement. But I encourage everybody, you can watch all the meetings at TREC via Zoom every time. Maybe it's Microsoft team meetings, but you can watch all the meetings. You can sit there, you can send in comments. If you ever have a reason to change something on it, or you think something needs to be changed on the contract, you can send it. I will promise you, we read every comment, but it is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. And I would just, and I encourage everybody to get involved. The way to do is get involved and not just be by the sidelines. But
right. Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, getting involved is really the key. It absolutely is. So at this point, let me go ahead and bring out, let's see, let me, okay. All right, let's go ahead and bring out David Jones. David is general counsel for Texas Realtors. And David, tell us a little bit about what you do and what brought us to this point from your experience.
Thanks, Shae. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, David Jones, Deputy General Counsel. I don't want to try and take my boss's job. It's Deputy General Counsel. I have been with Texas Realtors for just over 8 years. I wear many different hats, but the legal team is responsible for updating and maintaining the Texas Realtors forms. Now, those are different than the real estate commission forms, which Mary mentioned. So TREC handles like the 1 to 4 family residential contract. That is a TREC form, so we don't touch that one. That's the TREC broker lawyer committee. But like listing agreements, buyer tenant representation agreements, we have compensation agreements. We have all that stuff. So we have been diligently following the NAR settlement and all the changes from that. We put together a forms task force of brokers from all over the state. And we met several times over several months to really kind of hammer out, not just to ensure that our forms meet the requirements of the settlement, but also trying to anticipate what practice changes are going to result. And so we want to make sure our forms are there and available for you and can do the job that you need to be done.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And with that, David's got some slides he wants to take us through. David, I'm just going to turn it over to you, and feel free to kind of run the show from here.
Okay, let's get those slides up. Make sure, are they up? We ready to go? There we go. Okay, so I will quickly go over the settlement and the requirements from the settlement, but I know what everybody really wants to get into are the forms. So I don't want to go all the way back to the beginning. We've been giving updates about the antitrust lawsuits for 4 years now. But back in March, NAR announced a settlement of that. And from that settlement came several practice changes that are coming by, as well as changes to the contracts. So these are sort of the core aspects of the settlement. There's a release of liability. So it's not just NAR, it's all the local associations, state associations, and each and every individual member as well is released from liability. Okay, you've got the offer of compensation. We'll get into the written buyer agreements that we'll get into as well. Timeline. NAR put this timeline out a while ago. Obviously, the next date coming up is August 17th. That is the deadline for all MLSs to adopt the changes. So when this first came out, it seemed like, a lifetime away. Now it's right around the corner. And MLSs have, I've talked to several of them, and they have various dates. So some may have already switched over and made the necessary change. I know August 1st is a popular one. Some are going up to August 15th, just a couple days before the deadline. So here are the changes. I know that's a lot to read, so let me kind of break it down for you. Basically, the first four, numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, all deal with the same thing, right? No offers of compensation on the MLS anymore. So there won't be any fields for offers of compensation. You can't put it in agent remarks or public remarks. No photographs. Shae mentioned the workarounds. No workarounds on this. No compensation anywhere on the MLS. That includes like a third-party app or platform that is pulling data from the MLS. They cannot sort of try to recreate what the MLS does. So no compensation on the MLS or anything else that is using MLS data. No compensation there. You can still, listing brokers can still offer compensation. It just has to be off of the MLS. So all your typical marketing materials, signage, email blasts, all that stuff, you can still have other ways to communicate that. It just cannot be on the MLS or associated with any MLS data. 5, no filtering out or restricting MLS listings that are communicated to customers. So you can't filter your list of property. If they meet your client's criteria, you have to give them the whole list. You cannot filter out what properties your client sees from that list based off of levels of compensation. One of the questions we get, well, what if my buyer client doesn't want to go see properties that are not offering compensation? Well, your buyer client, they're the boss, they're in charge. If they don't want to go see a property, they don't have to, but make sure on your end, you're still giving them the whole list. And then from that list, let your client pick and choose what they want to go see, what they want to submit offers. Is the agent is not the one who should be filtering out that list beforehand before you give it to them. Okay, give them the whole list. Number 6 and number 7, I've got, let's see, we'll get into a little more detail. So number 6 is compensation disclosures. So there's 2 disclosures that have to be done. One is that broker compensation is not set by law and fully negotiable. The second one, if you have to disclose to the seller and obtain seller's authority for any compensation or offer of compensation that's going to come from the listing broker or the seller. Okay, both of these are in the listing agreements and buyer rep agreements. Texas Realtors has updated all of our forms to be fully in compliance. So if you're using Texas Realtors forms, you are going to be in compliance with these requirements. The next one is the written agreement with buyers. Okay, this one is a big one. I know there's lots of questions on this. Must have a written agreement when working with a buyer before touring a home. Okay, so all of those words and phrases, they have specific meaning. So what does it mean if you are working with a buyer? Well, basically, you're providing brokerage services to a buyer. Okay, are you representing the buyer's interests? So identifying properties, negotiating, presenting offers, all those things that you typically would think of, I am representing this person. So that does not include working only as an agent or a sub-agent for the seller, such as if you're the listing broker and you are holding an open house. Okay, we get that question a lot. The listing broker hosting their own open house does not have to get written agreements signed with every single buyer that comes in, because under the terms of this rule, you are not working with a buyer, right? You are working with the seller. You have full authority to provide access to a property under your representation agreement with the seller, the listing agreement. Okay, so you do not have to get written agreements if you are the listing broker opening up your property. Okay, everybody else, if you're working with the buyer, then you need to get this written agreement signed. Okay, touring the home, that means when the buyer and or the buyer and their agent physically enter the home, but that would include like a virtual tour. Like if you're the agent touring the home and you've got your iPad up and your buyer's on the other end looking, okay, that would still count. NAR uses the word touring. You know, they're speaking to a national audience, so sometimes they use different words or phrases than we might use in Texas. Obviously, we refer to that as a showing. Home means a 1 to 4 family residential building. So it does not impact showing vacant land. It does not impact commercial property. So you do not have to get a written agreement with buyers before you show those types of properties. As an attorney, I'm still going to kind of advocate that you use written agreements. Because they spell out clearly what your rights, remedies, your obligations are with your client. So I'm still saying you should get written agreements, but you're not required to get them for commercial properties, vacant land, and it is with a buyer. So it is not required for leasing transactions. Okay. The lawsuit and the settlement are really focused on the residential brokerage. Okay, so there are 3 requirements with this buyer written agreement. 1, you got to disclose the amount or rate of compensation that the broker will receive. That amount or rate of compensation must be objectively ascertainable. It cannot be open-ended. Okay, basically you have to have like a definite, specific amount of compensation. So it can't be like a range. You can't say my compensation is going to be anywhere from, $100 to $500. It has to be something specific. And finally, there has to be a term in that written agreement that prohibits the participant from receiving compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in the agreement. Okay, so basically the buyer has to know specifically what they're paying their agent. The common question we get about that is, well, can we amend it later? Yes, you can. So if you enter into a buyer representation agreement with a certain compensation amount in there, and then you find out that the seller or the listing broker is offering more than that, can you go back and amend it? Yes, that can be done, but keep in mind the amendment has to be signed by the buyer. So the buyer has to agree to that as well. Okay. Essentially, these rules put buyers and sellers in the driver's seat of compensation, what they are going to pay. Okay. So I mentioned the offers of compensation. They are prohibited on the MLS, but you can still communicate them off of the MLS. I get tons of questions like, how are we supposed to do that? And I would, use your creativity with this one. I've heard, can you put it on the sign? Sure. Can you have, marketing information that points to your website? Can a broker put offers of compensation on their website? Yes. Okay. It can go on your website. Even if the broker has an IDX feed that is pulling MLS data, you can still have it on your website. That is like sort of an exception. That's a carve out to, you can't have MLS data on your website. You can have an IDX feed that is pulling MLS data, and the broker can still have offers of compensation. The key is it can only be offers of compensation for your own properties. So you cannot aggregate a bunch of different brokers and their compensation levels. Okay. The broker can have on their website just listings, just offers of compensation for their own listings, and even if they have an IDX feed from the MLS. Okay, let's talk about the forms. Kind of first, let me give you sort of the 10,000-foot view, just kind of overview of what's going on here, so you can kind of understand, why we did what we did. So first, you have all of those rules that are coming down because of the settlement, and all those rules, by the way, are MLS rules. So we get asked, well, what about enforcement? Who's looking out for this? These are MLS rules. So it is up to each individual MLS to enforce those rules. Okay, so they have the same enforcement over any other MLS rules, that if they feel that someone is violating those rules, they have the authority to enforce those rules. So that's where that comes down. But now let's talk about the forms. Because compensation was primarily done one way, right? The seller agreed to pay their listing broker, and that amount that the listing broker was paid included an amount that the listing broker was going to go into the MLS and offer to compensate buyers brokers. Okay, the MLS created a very efficient way to handle broker compensation, and that became the primary way that compensation was handled. That's not the only way. It wasn't the only way to handle compensation before, but it was the primary way because it was so efficiently done through the MLS. Well, that's gone, right? MLS compensation no longer on the MLS. So now what we have is all these other possible forms or ways to compensate brokers, both the listing side and the buyer side. So now all these other ways are now put on the table. And so we have to make sure that the forms that are available for you to use can manage that. So what we've done with Texas Realtors and our forms, it's all about two things. It's about consumer choice. So we put all of these possible ways for broker compensation to be done. So it's not just the one way of pay your listing broker and then listing broker shares with the buyer's broker. That's one way. There are others. The other aspect is transparency. Okay, if one thing we learned from these lawsuits is that we need to be far more transparent when it comes to broker compensation. Okay, do brokers have every right to be fairly compensated for your efforts? Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. It just needs to be transparent. From the consumer point of view, the consumer is paying their broker for their services, and the consumer needs to know what they're paying, under what circumstances that payment is going to be made. If it's going to include, if I'm the seller and I pay my listing broker, what's the listing broker going to do with that? Okay. It needs to have a big old, shiny spotlight shined on the compensation so that every single consumer, buyer and seller, knows what's going on. So here are the forms. Our forms came out June 24th. So almost a month they've been out. So we really focus on the representation agreements, so listing agreements and buyer rep agreements. We came out with a new form, the residential buyer tenant rep agreement short form. And I've got images of all these and of the relevant provisions. So we're going to get into all that, y'all. I see a lot of questions. We're going to get into detail in just a second. We also have an addendum to the TREC contract to dealing with brokers' fees, and we updated broker compensation agreements. Okay, so the first question we get asked is, what if we have a listing agreement or a buyer rep agreement before they got updated? So if you have a version before the new ones came out on June 24th, do you have to go and sign new ones? Is there a way to amend them? So we created this amendment. Okay, we're considering this really a temporary form, 2701. It's an amendment to representation agreement. So this is sort of a universal amendment. It has one purpose and one purpose only. And that is to get any of the older version of representation agreements to bring them in compliance with the new rules. Okay, it doesn't do anything else. It doesn't change any of the terms. It doesn't change compensation. It does that one thing. So it can be used with the listing agreements. We've got the list there up at the top. So the exclusive right to sell, the exclusive right to lease, the farm and ranch listing agreements, and the buyer tenant representation agreement, which we now call the long form 1501. Okay, if you're using the short form 1507, that is already in compliance, so there's nothing to amend. But any of those listing agreements or buyer rep agreements that you entered into prior to June 24th may have to be updated so that they are in compliance. The key date there is the deadline, the August 17th deadline that the rules come into effect. So if you are still working with a buyer or a seller on August 17th using an older version of the forms, okay, you're going to have to at least use this amendment to get them in compliance. Now, if your client is already under contract by that date, then you don't want to do anything because there are already triggers in that agreement, like the earned and payable. Okay. You don't need to amend it if your client is under contract to buy or sell property on August 17th. But if you're still under a older version of the listing agreement or buyer tenant rep agreement, August 17th, and your client is not under contract, then you're going to at the very least execute this to bring it into compliance. Alternatively, you can sign a brand new listing agreement that came out on June 24th. That works too. But if you don't want to have to refill out everything, at the very minimum, you need this to bring it into compliance by the August 17th. Okay, let's jump into the tricky parts. These are the listing agreements. So we updated 3 listing agreements: the residential exclusive right to sell, exclusive right to lease, and the farm and ranch were updated with this change. Okay, commercial is not affected by this. Remember, the lawsuit and the settlement are focused on residential. Farm and ranch is included in this because there very well may be a single family dwelling on a farm and ranch property. Sort of having that different category of farm and ranch, that's kind of, a Texas thing. We got a different contract for that. But for the NAR settlement, there is no separate category of property for farm and ranch. Is there a 1 to 4 family dwelling on the property? So even if even if you're using a farm and ranch contract, the settlement terms might still apply if it's got that 1 to 4 in there. So here's basically what we did with the paragraph 5 broker compensation in our listing agreements. It's very striking. We have box A and box B. This is about transparency. We wanted to make it perfectly obvious, perfectly clear to sellers that are looking at this agreement that you have options. You can pay your broker's fee and offer compensation to the other broker, the buyer's broker, or you can just pay your broker's fee without compensation. And we felt about separating these into option A or option B was the most transparent way to do this. So I like to think of this as the fork in the road, right? The whole transaction starts with the seller, a property owner wanting to sell their property, and they enter into a listing agreement. So this contract is the thing that kicks off the transaction. And how the seller and the listing broker agree to handle compensation, this is the fork in the road. And so many other questions that you might have, or how the transaction goes after this moment, will depend on, are you using 5A or are you using 5B? 5A is the traditional way of doing compensation. Okay, that's where the seller pays the broker a fee that includes an amount that the listing broker is then going to share with the buyer's broker if the buyer's broker, procures a buyer, is the procuring cost of that transaction. And we put plenty of, parentheticals and instructions, right? Broker's fee with compensation for the other broker. Insert total amount for broker and other broker. So we try to make it as blatantly obvious that this box is, seller, this is what you're agreeing to. Box B is the other fork in the road. That's without compensation for the other broker. So that amount should only represent what the seller is agreeing to pay their broker, the listing broker only. Now we get asked in box 5A. A2, that's the part where the listing broker is going to compensate the buyer's broker. Okay, that's if there's another broker that procures a buyer. If there is no other broker, then the listing broker retains the entire amount in 5A. Okay, that's the way it's done now. The seller is agreeing to compensate their broker that amount. And then if there is another broker, and there's a big if there is another broker, then the broker will compensate the other broker. If there is not, the broker still maintains the entire amount in 5A1. The difference between the way it was before and the way it is now is those two paragraphs were separated. So you had the broker compensation was in paragraph 5, but the other broker's compensation, the cooperative compensation, that was in a completely different paragraph 8. And it didn't make sense that it was in a different paragraph. That conversation should happen at the same time. So we moved up the cooperative compensation to paragraph 5. One of the things, the way that we designed this compensation paragraph is we know that listing brokers should be sitting down at the table with their client having this conversation. And we wanted the structure of this paragraph to almost be like a blueprint. It should facilitate that conversation that listing brokers have with their clients. And so this, complete either 5A or 5B only. This is like the fork in the road choice. How does the seller want to deal with broker compensation? So let's say now 5B, the seller says, you know what? I don't want to pay the broker, the buyer's broker. Or maybe they say, I'll stay open. I don't want to agree to it now, but I'll be open to it later on when the offers come in. Okay, so that's 5B. What we talked to when we talked to the brokers on our task force, it was, well, if the seller is only going to compensate their broker starting off, it's going to be pretty common that the buyer, when they start submitting offers, are going to still request that the seller or the listing broker pay some money towards their broker's fees. Okay. If it's not the listing broker doing it initially, then the buyer is probably going to ask the seller. So that's what that notation down at the bottom is under 5B. Okay. It's just a note. There's nothing to fill in. It's letting the seller know that in addition to paying your broker's fees, that a buyer might ask you to contribute money towards buyer's expenses, which could include broker's fees. And so now the next question is, does the seller want their listing broker to tell everybody that, to advertise that? Because the seller might be choosing 5B because they say, I don't want to pay. Let the buyer pay their own. But the seller, like I said, they may be, I'll be open to it. Send in your request, send me an offer, and then we can negotiate that. So the listing broker needs to make sure they know what the seller wants to do and get that authorization. So that's where the note points you down to paragraph 11F. That is the broker's authority regarding seller's contributions. Okay, and it's just a checkbox. Either seller does or does not authorize their broker to share information with, prospective buyers that the seller is open to contributing towards buyer's expenses. Okay, so we're talking about like paragraph 12, or specifically asking the seller or requesting that the seller pay buyer's brokers. There's a difference, and I'll talk about that in a second. So I want to be clear on this one. Paragraph 5A, the listing broker getting paid money, getting paid a fee, and then they're going to offer compensation to the buyer's broker. You do not need paragraph 11F for that. I think we didn't realize that was a confusing aspect, but we're getting a lot of questions. For the listing broker to offer compensation that's going to be paid by the listing broker, you already have authority to advertise that. That's kind of that's the whole point of 5A, is that the seller wants you to let brokers know you're going to compensate the buyer's broker. So you already have authority. Okay, it's also down in paragraph 11. Paragraph 11, by the way, the reason why all this stuff about authority to advertise is not right here. This is paragraph 5, so this is broker compensation. So the broker's authority is in a different paragraph. It's in paragraph 11. So that's why we are referring you down to paragraph 11 to start talking about what's your authority. So it's a paragraph 11D. I don't have a image of that one, but it's 11D, number 4 on the listing agreement that gives the broker authority to advertise offers of compensation being paid by the listing broker. It's already there. There's no checkbox needed. But if the seller wants the listing broker to advertise that the seller is open to contributions, that's where you need 11F. You need to make sure you get that authority and check that the seller does authorize. Okay. So there's a little difference between whether the listing broker is offering compensation or whether the seller is open to seller concessions. Okay. So the next part of that conversation.
Hey, David, before you go on, let me just ask a quick question of clarity on that last section you were just going over, if you don't mind.
Sure. Let me
go back. Can we go back to that other screen? And what was the last thing you were just saying?
The difference between if it's the listing broker who's going to offer compensation, like the way you used to do it on the MLS, the listing broker already has authority, so you don't have to check box 11F for the listing broker to put on their website that the listing broker is offering compensation. So that would be if you're using 5A, you don't need that additional authority to advertise that. It's only if you're like under 5B and the seller is saying, I will consider, seller concessions. I'll consider that. And the listing broker, it's okay for you to tell people that the seller is open to seller concessions. That's what 11F is for.
Okay, so that's what I was hoping for, that to kind of clarify it. So if we're using 5A, broker can already offer compensation.
Correct.
If we're using 5B, that means seller is open to negotiating for compensation.
That's correct.
Got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this one, next form, seller's authorization to disclose and advertise certain information, TXR 1412. This is not a new form, but we did update it with that language in paragraph A. This was after we talked to several MLSs. The issue with seller concessions on the MLS, that's part of the rules. That's allowable under the rules, that you cannot have offers of compensation to buyers brokers on any MLS, but you can have seller concessions. Okay, but those seller concessions cannot be earmarked for broker fees, right? Because sellers have been paying concessions, before the settlement. It's, paragraph 12 in the 1-4 contract deals with the seller saying, I will pay an amount towards buyer's expenses. But now going forward, a lot of MLSs are adding a field specifically for seller concessions. And it's sort of all over the board. We don't know, MLSs have discretion to either add that field or not. And they have discretion on what that field looks like. So some are just putting a yes, no checkbox. Yes, seller's open for concessions, or no, seller is not. Some are even going further and having a place to actually insert an amount. It could be a flat fee, or it could be a percent of the sales price, but that is not universal. So we didn't want to put a blank line for that number in the listing agreement. We felt that would just confuse sellers who are not in an MLS where you could do that. But we did want to make sure that listing brokers, if you are working in an MLS and the seller says, yes, I am open to seller concessions, but not only that, I want you to tell them, here's the amount. Here's the amount that I'm open for seller concessions. So we put in a blank line, paragraph A on this form. So if you need that specific authorization that you're going to put on an MLS, that if your MLS allows that, an actual number to put on the MLS. Okay, so if you're in an MLS that doesn't have that specific number, you don't need this additional form. Okay, so this is only needed if it's not just seller is open to seller concessions. The seller also wants to specifically put an amount out there that this is how much I'm willing to put out there. Now, keep in mind, this is just like an invitation to submit offers. This number is not binding on the seller. That's very important. We put it in here in bold. Seller's not obligated to put this amount. It's like the list price, right? The seller's not bound to the list price. It's just an invitation for buyers. Hey, submit an offer somewhere, somewhere around this vicinity of this number. So this does the same thing. Seller's not bound, but if the seller wants a specific amount known, you can use this agreement to get that authorization. And paragraph B is really generic. Okay. If you want to make sure that the seller, they want you to say anything else. And there's some examples in there, like any kind of conditions of the property or anything like that. If you want to make sure that you're going to tell people, market this property with certain words, make sure your seller knows that you're going to say that. This is what this form is used for. Okay. Okay, amendment to the listing agreement. Again, not a new form, but we updated it. This is an interesting document because this is a universal form. Okay, so this works with all of the Texas Realtors listing agreements. We have like 6 different listing agreements. We got the residential ones, we got commercial ones, we got the farm and ranch ones. We wanted to add compensation here. Before we didn't. Those paragraphs C and D with the boxes around it, those are the new paragraphs. But it was a really basic form. You could amend, you could change the list price, you can change when the listing agreement ended, but it was a very basic form. And it had to be basic because it was universal for all the different ones. But we felt with these new rules that there might be a lot more changing of compensation after the agreement was originally signed. So we wanted to put in something in here to make it easier to update or amend compensation from what it was originally agreed to. The problem is all those different listing agreements that we have, they're all different. There's like 5 different versions of the compensation. So we couldn't put all of them on one universal form. Okay, so for now, we felt it was important to at least hit the most common. So 1101 and 1201, that is the exclusive right to sell, the residential exclusive right to sell, and 1201 is the farm and ranch. So those are the compensation paragraphs that can be changed in those two forms. The rest of the paragraphs can still be used for all the other listing agreements, but specifically for those two listing agreements, we wanted to make sure that you had an easy way to go in and amend those compensations. So C is the broker's fee. Okay, you can switch from 5A or to 5B. You can, keep it. If it started off as 5A and you want to change it, you can keep it as 5A. So it has flexibility to switch from whatever was originally agreed to where you're going. Paragraph D, that is the broker's compensation. That's the cooperative compensation for the other broker. Okay, that is only 5A has that provision. Remember, 5B is the one that did not have compensation going to the other broker. So you can switch this. So if you originally started off with 5B and then the seller has a change of heart and he says, okay, I want to offer compensation, you could do it with this amendment. Okay, you can, on paragraph C, you would switch over to 5A, that check box. And then you could checkbox D on what compensation the listing broker is going to then offer. For all those other listing agreements, if you want to change compensation, you can still do it, even though there's not a pre-printed, paragraph that you can just check. The paragraph F at the bottom is sort of the catch-all. So compensation for any other agreement or any other term would go in paragraph F. You just identify what paragraph and then you type in the change. So only C and D are the ones that are limited to those two listing agreements. The rest of it can be still used universally for all the other listing agreements. Okay, representation disclosure 1417, another, it's an older form. It's not new, but we did update it. This one dealt with, and it's not that old of a form. I think we've only had it for a few years. This is to comply with a specific Texas law in the occupation code, where a real estate license holder, when you represent somebody, you have to disclose to the other party in the transaction or that party's agent, you have to disclose who you represent. Okay, it can be done in writing or orally, and you've been doing this all the time. Okay, because when you first meet somebody walks into, an open house, you say, hey, I'm David Jones. I'm the listing broker here, or I represent the seller, done. You've complied because you can do it orally. But we had some members who said, well, I would like to at least have something in writing. So I have documentation of it. We said, absolutely, because the law says orally or in writing. So we created this document here for that purpose. Just you have something in writing to prove that you told the other person who I represent. It came up during discussions with our task force that we wanted to make sure that there was no issue of implied agency. So we want to make sure that that other person who you're talking to, they understand that you're not representing them and you're not trying to represent them. So we added some language in paragraph C that kind of just explains what, you represent somebody, you have a fiduciary, and we added the acknowledgement there at the bottom in bold that the undersigned person acknowledges that there is no agency relationship. So we just kind of beefed it up a little bit, made it stronger so that it was clear. Listing brokers were worried that, I previously said that if you're a listing broker and you are hosting an open house, that when buyers come in, you don't have to get a written agreement signed. But they were like, well, we still want something. We want proof that we had this conversation, and we want proof that they know we don't represent them. And so we beefed it up a little bit. So this is good for listing brokers who want to make it clear that these buyers that are coming in, you don't have to get a written agreement signed, but if you want to make sure they understand you represent the seller only, this is great for you. This is not the written agreement requirement. Okay. It does not satisfy that. It's specifically for making sure everybody understands who you represent. Okay. It can be used by the other side. Like if you have a buyer You represent the buyer and they want to go look at a for sale by owner home. And you want to make sure that the for sale by owner understands that you're not there trying to represent them too, that you've got this buyer and that's it. Okay. All right. The buyer tenant representation agreement. This is the 1501. This is the one that you've had before. Okay. All we did was we renamed it. We tacked on long form to it. And that's just to distinguish this one between the other one that we've created, the short form, which we'll get into in a couple minutes. Okay. All that bold language right at the top, those are all the requirements that I mentioned before. Okay, that broker compensation not set by law, fully negotiable. Brokers independently determine their fees. That's something that a lot of people get confused over, is that when you hear negotiable, they think that brokers have to lower their fee when somebody asks. Well, that's not what negotiable means. It just means that Texas Realtors, there's no law, there's no rule, there's no MLS policies, NAR setting compensation. Each broker gets to independently determine their fees, and you can negotiate it at will. So we want to make sure that that was in there as well. And then finally, that last line in that bold section, broker is prohibited from receiving compensation for broker services from any source that exceeds the amount stated in this agreement. Okay. So what that means is it's very important to have that initial conversation with the buyer, and you need to know what you're worth. What are your services worth? What's your value? You need to have that conversation and indicate that number in your written buyer representation agreement, because that term says you can't get paid more than that. Again, yes, you can amend it later, but that's going to require your buyer, your client, to agree to that. So if your client later says, no, I think you're fine, you're getting paid enough, then you can accept that. So it really highlights that initial conversation, know what your value is, know what you're worth, and figure out what your compensation structures are. It is a buyer and tenant representation agreement, so it works for both. So 5A1 for purchases, if you've got a buyer there. Leasing for if you've got a tenant. We had to make some alterations to this one. If you notice, there are no blank lines other than specific amounts. That is specific. That is intentional because of the requirement that compensation has to be objectively ascertainable. One of the underlying principles of Texas Realtors forms is that is risk reduction. We want to make sure that our members are sort of guided to complying with laws, rules, whatever. And so having blank lines in this section, so for members to just write whatever they want to, we felt like that was going to get members in trouble. So we only have definite amounts for you to put in. One question we always get asked about bonuses. Can you get a bonus? The answer is yes, you can get a bonus, but your client has to authorize it. Your client has to agree to the bonus. And because the compensation, including bonuses, has to be objectively ascertainable, you basically have to wait until you know what the bonus amount is. So you can't just have a generic term in there that says, I'm entitled to any bonuses that I receive, because that's not going to meet the requirements of the settlement. So we have added, down here at the bottom, we've added a notation about bonuses and other compensation. If you notice, it doesn't have any blank lines in it. It basically explains to the buyer to have that conversation about it's possible that there may be more compensation available, such as a bonus, and that you have to disclose that specific amount, and that the broker or the client then gets to authorize that. And where that authorization is an amendment. Let me come back to that. There's the amendment. Okay, paragraph E is where the amendment is. So once you have that objectively ascertainable amount, and bonuses are going to be property specific. So once you have that information, that's when you can sign the amendment so that you're entitled to the bonus, which means, yes, the buyer needs to agree to that. Okay, that's the whole point of the settlement, is that buyers and sellers need to be in the driver's seat of compensation. They need to know how much they are paying their representative, and they need to agree to those amounts. And that was really the only way to get bonuses in a way that is still compliant with all of these rules. Okay, it can't just be a range of amount. It can't just be, if there's a bonus, then I get to keep it. It has to be an objectively ascertainable way, which you have to wait until your buyer is going to submit an offer on the property that's offering the bonus. Once you know that amount and that property, you can get your client's authorization. Obviously, this is not a legal requirement, but these conversations should be done at the beginning. Like, you need to prep your clients and have this conversation. Talk about your value. Talk about everything that you do. Talk about why you feel that you are worth the bonus or the compensation. Talk about all of that stuff and prep your client before it happens. So then when the buyer does want to buy a property that is offering the bonus, you've already had that conversation. Okay, I skipped a couple things. Let's go back. All right, the new form, the short form, residential buyer tenant representation agreement, short form. This form was created at an overwhelming request from our members. Our buyer rep agreement, our long form that we call now, is 5 pages long. And we have been asked for years about making something simpler. So we came up with this short form. It is a 1-page document. Now, first off, you can fit more legal stuff to try not to use any legalese. You can fit more legal stuff in a 5-page agreement than you can 1 page. So this form is a basic form. So it does not have all of the same stuff. We couldn't cram all the same stuff in 5 pages in here. This is not a requirement for you to use the short form. Okay. Each brokerage can come up with policies about which form that they want to use. Under what circumstances do they want their agents to use it? But again, going back to something I said initially, everything's on the table. And we want to make sure there are forms available for members to practice the way that they want to practice. So I've talked to some brokers that say, you know what, it scares me, I don't want to use it. I say, you can make that choice. And I've talked to other brokers that this is the best thing that I've seen from Texas Realtors ever. And I say, thank you. Well, kind of. But yeah, so some love it, some hate it. It's, brokers can have their policies for their agents to use. So make sure, if you're an agent, make sure you talk to your broker regarding, use of this form. This form is essentially 2 forms in one. It can be used for full brokerage services, the way you've been representing buyers all this time. But the new thing is, it can also be used for showing services only. And this came from, the new requirement that you have to have a written agreement with the buyer just to tour or show a property. So we talked to a lot of agents and they say, well, we just want something simple in that case, because representing a buyer is different than representing the seller. The seller might want to come in and, the sellers understand it's a major purchase for them. So they're perfectly fine when you slap in an 11-page agreement in front of them. But a buyer, they were 5 minutes ago, they were on their computer looking at properties on somebody's website. Now they just want to go see a property. They don't want to be slapped with a 5-page agreement right then and there, but now you have to have one. And so we created this agreement for those situations, and especially for if the buyer just wants to, hey, look, man, I just want to go see a property, and you're throwing this agreement at me. So the showing services option, I think I got a close up of that. That's paragraph 5. The showing services option basically cuts the agreement off at paragraph 5. Okay, the first thing it says is paragraph 6, 7, and 8 don't apply because you don't need those other terms for showing services. And the broker is only agreeing to provide access to properties. That's it. The client will pay broker. We included a flat fee. Okay, it's a new thing. We're going to see how the market plays out. If we need more complex, fee structures, we can look at that later. Can you have more complex fee structures? Brokers have said, well, what if we want like a price per property that we show them? It's like you can add like an addenda, you can add an exhibit to this document, but this is the first trial, so we included a simple flat fee. If you want something more advanced, then talk to legal counsel about drafting up some type of addenda or exhibit that you can add a more complex fee structure. The fee is due upon execution of this agreement. We get asked, well, how is that supposed to happen? Like the agents are out in the field, they meet somebody, how are you supposed to pay? Those are going to be broker policies. Okay, that's not for the contract. Brokers can come up with policies about how the fee payment is going to work. I will give you just one example. It's not required, but it's an example that I've heard. It was creative. The broker can set up, some of these, like Venmo accounts or PayPal or Cash App. And a lot of those, you can create a QR code, and you can put that QR code on a business card, on a marketing pamphlet. Put the QR code on the corner, and the buyer, you can go and meet the buyer at the property. They can take out their phone, and then they can send whatever money. And since the broker sets it up, that money goes straight to the broker. Okay. Again, not required, just one of the creative things that I've heard. So as far as the payment of the fee goes, that's going to be up to the broker policy. And so really this wasn't designed for that, hesitant buyer that we get asked, well, what if, the buyer just doesn't want to they refuse. They don't want to sign anything. Okay. This document has so much flexibility in it. It's ridiculous. Okay. So that's why I put these 3 paragraphs up here. So paragraph 3 talks about the market area, and you get to define the market area. So the market area could be as small as 1 property, right? This is the agreement you're signing with this buyer. 1 property. That's it. The term. How long does this agreement last? It could be 1 day. You can check showing services. That's the extent of the services that you're providing. And we also get asked, what about the fee? Can we put 0? Yes, you can put 0 in there. All right. There are still there's no issue with consideration. There's still other promises in there that the parties are making. So you don't need money as consideration here. So 1 property, 1 day for $0. Okay, that's to help with those situations where you have a very hesitant buyer that says, hey, I just want to look at properties. Well, our rules require us to sign an agreement, and here it is. One thing I do want to point out, the title, Residential Buyer Tenant Representation Agreement. This is a representation agreement, folks. Even showing services, there's representation here. What you're agreeing to is you're just agreeing to provide this one service as part of that representation. So you're not agreeing to sit down and pull comps and write the offer and negotiate and go all the way to the closing table. That's full services. If that's what you agree to, fine. If not, you can do showing services. But there is still representation. Okay, there is fiduciary duty, but your fiduciary duty is regarding the services that you have agreed to provide. Okay, there's a lot of confusion over that. People think fiduciary duty means you have to do everything. Does not mean you have to do everything. You can agree on what services you're going to perform and what you don't. And to the extent you're providing those services, that's where your duty is. Okay, so we've had conversations with TREC. We're good. Showing services, perfectly legal. You still have to comply with minimum duties. Okay, but yes, you can agree to limit the services that you provide. Okay, talked about the amendment. So what happens if you start off with showing services and now, that buyer has, they like you. You've had a chance. That was one of the things that the brokers of the task force said. You can use the showing services in the short form to basically, it literally and figuratively get you into the door because you need a written agreement with them. So you needed to walk in the door with the buyer. That gives you that one-on-one time with that buyer where you can, that's that initial introduction. So you can share your knowledge and your experience and your expertise so that when that buyer does want to submit an offer, that they'll come to you. If that's the case, and now you initially started off as showing services and now they're ready to use you to submit an offer, we have the amendment that can do that. So paragraph C is where you can switch from full services or showing services to full service. If you do, you now have to consider intermediary, right? You do not have to consider intermediary just for the showing. Okay. So even if you're showing a buyer a property that your brokerage also lists, that's not when intermediary kicks in. It doesn't kick in until the offer is being contemplated. So just for showing services, you do not need the intermediary authorization. But if that buyer says, okay, I do want to use you to submit an offer, now you have to get the intermediary authorization. And now, because it's gone from showing services with that one small flat fee, and now you want to consider, a fee for actually purchasing the property, we have paragraph D is for broker's fees. So you can switch, still using the short form, from showing services to full service. Another option, y'all, is if you really like 1501, the long form buyer rep agreement, you can switch to that one. So you can start off with the short form using showing services, but once you develop that trust, like they may not have wanted to sign a 5-page agreement with you right away, but once you develop the trust after you've shown them some properties and you've shown your experience and your knowledge, and now they do want to use you, you can switch over to 1501, the long form. Okay. Again, it's all about flexibility, being able to practice how you want to practice. Okay. Compensation agreement. This is probably going to be the workhorse of Texas Realtors forms. This is the agreement that is used to replace the offer of compensation on the MLS. Okay. So now offers of compensation off the MLS. One of the things that some agents don't realize is that the MLS created a legally binding contract between brokers, even though you never had to sign anything. When the listing broker put a BAC, the buyer's agent commission, on the MLS, if the buyer's agent was then the procuring cause of the transaction, legally binding contract. That's gone. So now you have to replace not just how you advertise that you're offering compensation, which we talked about being on the broker's website, but now you also have to replace that agreement. And this is it. Okay, this is form 2402. And it is signed by the listing broker and the buyer's broker. And what we have done, we have updated it. We've made it simpler to use. Okay, you agree on the fee. And we have incorporated procuring cause into this. I think I thought I had to close up that. So we had in paragraph 5B, procuring cause is the standard. So that was the standard for MLS compensation. The buyer's agent had to be the procuring cause. We've incorporated that standard into this document. So it's still going to be familiar to everybody that the cooperating broker, the buyer's broker, has to be the procuring cause of the sale in order to be entitled to the compensation. So what does that do? It allows the listing broker the freedom to sign multiple compensation agreements. For example, multiple offer situations. We anticipate this document to be executed by the listing broker and cooperating broker before the offer is sent in, right? Just the same way that the listing broker and cooperating broker knew what the compensation was because it was on the MLS, you did that before the offer was sent in. Okay, this is replacing that agreement. So it's anticipated that the listing broker and cooperating broker come up with this agreement before the offer is sent in. And listing brokers, you are free to sign multiple of these in multiple offer situations because you don't know which one the seller is going to accept yet. And have the confidence that you will only ever have to compensate the cooperating broker, that is the procuring cause of the transaction. Okay. Now, one note regarding ethical duties. It's important to understand, this can and probably should be executed prior to offers. Buyers brokers, buyers agents, you cannot hold that offer hostage. You can't say, well, I've got offer, but you better sign this and you better give me what I want. Okay, that's a violation of Article 16 of the Code of Ethics all day long. You cannot hold the offer hostage. You enter into those negotiations, you figure out what that number is, and you come up to an agreement. Okay, whether that agreement fully pays for your buyer's, your buyer's fee in the buyer rep agreement, or if it's zero, whatever that negotiation is with the listing broker, you take that information back to the buyer and you ask them, how do you want to proceed? If the buyer wants to continue to submit that offer on there, yes, submit the offer, but now you know how much compensation there is from the listing broker. Maybe the buyer wants to add on, compensation from the seller in the contract. Okay, so like I said, anticipated that this agreement is signed prior to the offer. Do not hold the offer hostage. Once you figure out what this number is, whatever the negotiations end up with, go back to the buyer and figure out what the buyer wants to do. Okay, this is a brand new one. Addendum regarding broker's fees. This one is an addendum to the TREC sales contracts. Okay, we don't do that a lot. There's only a couple other forms that actually get attached to the sales contract. The compensation, the compensation agreement between brokers, that's between the brokers, right? The listing broker, cooperating broker sign this. This one, the addendum regarding broker's fees, the buyer and the seller sign it because this becomes part of the sales contract. So this one gets attached to the 1-to-4 contract. We have made this contract, it can be confusing because we wanted to put everything in one document. Okay, so if you take a look at paragraph B, fees, cash fees, as specified in this addendum, will be paid in, blank county in Texas. People always ask that, that's kind of legal stuff. It establishes where the contract was supposed to be performed. So if there's like a lawsuit over this, that tells you what county you go to for, a lawsuit. That's where you file a lawsuit. So basically it could be, there's not one set way. It could be where the property is, where the title company is. It could be where the brokerage office is. You're filling it out. Most people, when they fill out a contract, you put where you are, right? Because if it becomes a problem, that's where you were supposed to perform. So that, gives you options to where you file a lawsuit. Paragraph C, listing broker's fee. Seller shall pay listing broker the fee specified in separate written agreement. That's the listing agreement between seller. That part, there's nothing to fill in. That's just giving the title company a heads up. It's letting you know that, hey, seller and their broker have an agreement. D is the other broker's fee. It's called the other brokers because we have to mirror the language in the 1-to-4 contract. And in the 1-to-4 contract, they call the buyer's broker is called the other broker. So it gives you options. Okay, these are, all the options are now on the table. So The other broker's fee could be paid by the listing broker, or it could be paid by the seller. And whatever amounts are coming from the listing broker or the seller, those get paid first. Anything left over that's in the buyer rep agreement is the responsibility of the buyer. So you have D1, that is the listing broker is going to pay, right? That's from compensation agreement between brokers, 2402, the last form. You put in the amount that mirrors what's in 2402. That is just a heads up. Okay, it's just a disclosure of what that amount is. It doesn't change that amount. So if 2402 has a different amount, then you write in here, you go back to 2402. That is the same thing, y'all, as that little disclosure on the bottom of page 10 of the 1-to-4 contract, where it says the listing broker has agreed to pay. That's the same thing. Okay. Paragraph D2 is if the seller is paying. If the seller is paying directly, so it's not the listing broker who's paying the buyer's broker, but the seller is paying the buyer's broker. 2A, that is if there's a separate agreement. Okay, just like we have the compensation agreement between brokers, we actually have a compensation agreement between a broker and an owner. So the seller can enter into a contract with the buyer's broker. I know that sounds a little weird because they both, they might both have, different brokers, but it's the buyer's broker over here is entering into with a direct contract with the seller for compensation. Okay, it's just one of the options. We're not saying that's the best way. It's just one of the options. The other way is number D2B. This is brand new. This actually adds a term to the 1-to-4 contract. D2B, that last blank line to fill out, is the seller agreeing to pay the other broker directly. That's a new term. So when you fill that one out, that's the seller and the buyer agreeing to that for the first time. All the other ones, those are other agreements that have already been entered into. And we're just letting the title company know that we've already entered into this stuff. But D2B, that last line is brand new. Okay, one of the questions that we always get, well, what about paragraph 12 in the contract? This is different than paragraph 12. Paragraph 12 is where the seller can agree to pay buyer's expenses, what people commonly refer to as seller concessions. Paragraph 12 in the 1-to-4 contract does not go to broker fees. It's got broker buyer's expenses is a defined term, and it lists a bunch of things like appraisal stuff and loan origination. It's got those things, but it does not include broker's fees. So if you put money in 12, that's not going to go to the broker. But if you use this addendum D2B, that money goes directly from the seller to the buyer's broker. It is different. You can have money in both. You can have some money in 12 and you can have some money on this one. The money in 12, the seller is paying, let's call them closing costs, buyer's general closing costs. The money on D2B in here, the seller is paying directly to the buyer's broker. Okay, last question, then last statement, then I'll open up for questions. Is this required? Okay, this form is not required to be attached to every single 1-to-4 contract. Okay, paragraph D is really the only thing that you're filling in information. Paragraph D1 and D2A, they're just referring to other contracts. It's just giving the heads up to the title company. So you can use it. So if the listing broker is paying the buyer's broker compensation, yes, you can use it. It's not required. You can fill in that little blank on page 10 of the contract. The only one that you would have to use this is the last line, D2B, because right now that is not possible in any other form. Mary Minor was mentioning the work that TREC, Broker Lawyer Committee, is doing. They may have something, later on in the year or first part of next year. But for right now, if the seller is going to pay the buyer's broker in the contract as part of a contractual term, that's the only place that you can do it right now. So you would be required to do this form. Okay. I do believe that is the last form that I have on my slideshow. I've seen the comments going crazy.
Great. Yeah. We've got a lot of comments, a lot of questions. I'm going to bring Mary back out here. David, thank you so much for going through that. And here we go. Yeah, that works. We are going to open this up for some questions. We've got several pages of questions, and we're gonna do this as best as we can. But first of all, let me see if I can change this view a little bit. There we go. First of all, I just want to say thank you, David. That was great, and I really appreciate the time taken to go over the nuances of the language. You're right. All of this is for the purpose of having better choices, better transparency, making sure, I think a lot of what you talked about is stuff that were best practices before. Now we've got to do this. And we've got clear pathways to document it. And I just appreciate all the work that's been put in. Okay, so let me see. Diana, let's go ahead. Can you, Diana, can you share with me the questions, and we'll just kind of take them one at a time. And if you can just send them to me in Slack or whatever, we'll go from there. But yeah, we want to make sure that we have some time to address as many of these questions as possible. If we can't get through them all and we don't get to the place where we can open it up, we'll mitigate that and figure out something else. I definitely want to get all your questions answered. And if we've got questions in the chat that haven't been answered yet, don't worry. We will get to every one of those at some point, somehow in the next few days or hours, we'll get to all of that. But okay, so here we've got the questions, and let me just start with some of the first ones, and we'll go from here. Let's see. If the seller indicates on the listing agreement in paragraph 5.2a, so if a seller indicates on the listing agreement in 5.2a that they would be paying the other agent a percentage, then I still need permission to disclose to other agents, which is agreed to in paragraph 11F. Let me read that again. If the seller indicates on the listing agreement that they will be paying the other agent a percentage, do we still need the permission to disclose to the other agents?
I got it. Yeah,
Okay.
if you're using 5A, okay, that's where the seller is paying their broker, the listing broker, a fee, and that fee includes an amount that's going to the buyer's broker. You already have the authorization to disclose that and advertise that. Okay, you do not have to check anything else in order to disclose the listing broker's offer of compensation. You only need 11F to disclose seller concessions. So if the seller is the one who's going to offer concessions, you need to make sure your seller has said, yes, I want you to do that.
Yeah, good call. One question that I think is important that I don't know if you can or not, but are you able to share these slides with us?
Sure. I can show you PowerPoints.
That would be great. If you'll share that with us, I'll make sure that the agents that are looking for them can get those as well. One other question says, let's see. So what if you're holding an open house on homes that you're not the listing agent? So I think that really brings up the question of sub-agency in all of this. If we're working as a sub-agent for the listing agent, how do we, or the listing brokerage, how do we handle these representation situations?
Right. Okay. All right. This is going to take a minute, y'all, because I got to get on the soapbox for a second. What's interesting about this conversation, because this is, I've been asked this a lot. is this brings up agency, right? Law of agency. This is like chapter 1 of law and agency. Who do you represent? In Texas, we do not have something called non-agency. Other states do. So you may have heard like stuff from NAR have talked about non-agency or non-agency agreements. That is not recognized in Texas. If you're providing brokered services and like showing a property, okay, hosting an open house, that's brokered services, you got to represent somebody. There's got to be the buyer or the seller or both under intermediary, right? But you got to represent somebody. So the question of subagency is you represent the seller, but you're not the listing broker. Okay. The IABS has the definition of subagency, and I don't like that definition because it's not clear. The IABS simply says something like if you don't have an agreement with the buyer and you're aiding the buyer in the transaction, then you're a subagent. Subagency is so much more than that. It's not just a name. It's not just, oh, if I don't have an agreement with the buyer, then I'm a subagent. Great. Agent. Agency laws still apply, right? That means representation. That means fiduciary duty. If you're going to claim to be a subagent, that means you truly need to represent the interests of the seller. So if you're holding an open house, hosting, and you're not the listing agent, why are you there? Who are you there to represent? If you're there to try to get buyers and to pass out your card and to get their name so that you can represent them, you ain't a subagent. You're trying to be a buyer's agent, right? So you have to be very, very clear who you represent in this transaction, right? And don't do it after the fact because now you're in trouble. I think the test is confidentiality, right? Fiduciary duty, old car, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, reasonable care. Confidentiality. You owe a duty of confidentiality to the person you represent. So check out this scenario. You're the listing broker. Let's do the easy ones. You're the listing broker. You're sitting there at an open house. Buyer comes in, unrepresented. You just fully disclose you're the listing broker. You represent the seller. And now the buyer just can't contain themselves with how much they love the property and they want to buy it. And we're going to offer whatever the seller wants. We have to have this property. If you're the listing broker, what do you do with that information? You tell your seller, right? You tell your client, hey, we got a live one. they love the property. They're going to send in an offer any day now. Let's do the other easy one. You're the buyer's agent. Sign written buyer representation agreement. And your seller, you're sitting in the car afterwards and your seller tells you how much you love that. Do you tell the seller? Of course not. You would never think of telling the seller. That would breach your duty of confidentiality. So if you're sitting there holding an open house, you're not the listing agent. That scenario happens to you. Buyer walks in, tells you all of this stuff about how much they love the property. What do you do? If you're going to claim you're a subagent, what should you do?
Tell the seller.
Tell the seller. If you told the seller, how mad would the buyer be? Because if you didn't fully explain to the buyer, hey, I'm a subagent, the consumer doesn't know what that means. If you didn't fully explain to that buyer that you're a subagent and you represent the interests of the seller, and now they tell you all their deep, dark secrets, that's going to be TREC complaints, code of ethics complaints. You might even get sued. So just saying you're a subagent has far bigger implications than just, I guess I'm a subagent. If I don't have an agreement with you, I'm a subagent. You have to have a clear understanding. Now, when I said that if you're in that situation, you're holding an open house, you're not the listing broker, and you should tell the seller, if you had like heart palpitations, if you were like, oh, there's no way I would ever do that, that's fantastic. that tells you who you're representing. If you have in your heart, you feel that that's confidential information, you're representing the buyer, right? It's like your heart figured out who you represent before your brain figured out who you represent. Okay. So you're not, so if you're in that position, I can't tell you who you represent. I can't tell you that. That you need to tell who you represent. You need to make that decision and do it before you walk in that door. Here, you could be a sub-agent. Now, sub-agency is tricky. It's always been weird to me, the whole concept of sub-agents, because you are helping a buyer, but you don't represent them, right? If you want to help a buyer, you should just go ahead and be a buyer's agent and get something signed. The minefields and the pitfalls that you have to navigate when you're being a sub-agent are tremendous. Here's the thing. If you're going to host somebody else's listing and you are trying to get buyers, just say you're representing the buyer. The thing that you got to do now is, because of this new requirement, you got to get an agreement signed. Like, that's really all you got to do. You got an agreement signed in order to show a property. And we've made that as convenient, as easy as we can with the short form, right? One property address. You don't have to charge a fee. It could be for one day. You're hosting an open house for somebody else's listing. You could have a stack of showing services agreement pretty much pre-filled out, because you know the address, you know what day you're there, and you could put in 0 and you can check showing services. And you can explain to everybody that walks in that says, these are part of our agreement. We have to have a written agreement. So be very, very careful with the sub-agency classification. It's not just a word that you get to throw around because you don't have an agreement with the buyer. Your agency, who you represent, and your fiduciary duty are affected by trying to claim you're a sub-agent.
I love what you said about, your heart deciding who you represent before your brain figured it out. Sub-agency is such a very nuanced subject. So this brings up another question, David. In 5B, one of the questions somebody asked was, can you put negotiable?
For the listing broker, you need to have it. This is not dealing with the settlement. Because the settlement has, that objectively ascertainable requirement, that is a requirement for the buyer's rep. Okay, so listing brokers have a little bit more leeway, but just, contract law, not the settlement, contract law, you have to, like, the material terms have to be in the contract. And so your fee is definitely a material term. So if you haven't, spelled out what your fee is to the listing broker, then I mean, you may not have a contract because you're missing a material term. So you have to put something in there.
And I think going back to some of the framework that we discussed in the beginning, this is all about clarity. This is all about having clear communication, making sure that expectations are known up front for all consumers, buyers and sellers. Everybody deserves to know to know what the expectations are up front of what they're going to be paid or what they're going to have to pay. And so to put that in as clear language as possible in those buyer and seller representation agreements, the listing agreement, buyer rep agreement. I think making sure we put figures in there is really what the consumer needs. They need that clarity. So there have been a lot of questions in the chat about leases and rentals. Just to say again, the settlement is not about rental transactions. The settlement is about sales and specifically about residential sales. This really kind of is just about the 1 to 4 and that farm and ranch. So we want to make sure that we're talking about this just in relationship to residential sales. I see another question in the chat about how this works for VA. We do know that the VA just allowed sellers to control, buyers to roll some of that contribution into the loan. That's not going to be put toward that cap for VA buyers. Let's see if the agreement shows for showing services not binding. Is the agreement for showing services not binding without a fee being paid?
Still
David,
binding. Still binding. Still binding. Yeah, they're talking about consideration. Learn that again. Law of contracts, probably chapter 1. Consideration. Consideration does not have to be money. Right. People can make promises. I will do this if you do that. So you don't have to have money for consideration. So yeah, the agent and the client are making promises to one another. You don't have to have money. You're okay. Still binding.
Great. Thank you so much. A lot of the questions that are left over from the chat are some policy questions. Just so that you guys know, we're working on that. We're still ironing out some policy about this. So whether or not it's going to be put on, let me ask you this, David. We did have some questions about, it gets into the syndication idea, but it's syndication from the broker site. So if we're allowing our agents to use a KV Core website, a Lofty site, that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, doesn't it? Where we can offer compensation on those that aren't directly tied to MLS or syndicated by the MLS, right?
Are you talking about where you're putting your offer of compensation?
Correct.
Yeah, it's about is that site pulling in any way, shape, or form? Is it connected to MLS data? Like, I'm not familiar with those specifics. I'm not a realtor. Yeah, I'm an attorney. So I'm not familiar with those specific sites. But I know, like, showing services, type apps, if they're pulling data, you can't use that platform for offers of compensation.
Okay.
So
it's pulling data.
IDX. I think it's basically if our websites are connected to IDX, we can't. If we don't have them connected to IDX, we can.
Okay.
Because the IDX is the MLS.
Right. So if it's not pushing it out to the MLS or syndicating it out, but it's just bringing it in and then we're adding that to it, that's still a no.
If the broker's website only has compensation for your own listings, you can still have offers of compensation even though you have an IDX feed. But you could not have multiple brokerage offices all doing that same thing and aggregating that information. So if it's my brokerage website, yes, I'm getting an IDX feed, I can still put my offers of compensation for my listings on that website.
And I think this gets into the question, personally, as broker, this gets into the question of, there are some instances where we can, but sometimes we don't stop to ask if we should before we ask if we can. And again, I want to say just one last time, all of this is about the consumer experience. All of this is about making sure, like David said in the beginning, that when we are showing our clients, our buyer clients, especially every house that's out there that fits their criteria, that we're not moving houses and options out of that list because it's not a 3% or a 2.5% or a 4%, or if we're not showing them everything based on some sort of compensation issue we have, then we're not fulfilling our fiduciary duty to that client. And we've got to make sure that, knowing our compensation is smart, but guiding that client based on our compensation is wrong. So this is all about just knowing again, we go back to transparency, clear communication. This is for everybody, agents, consumers, sellers, buyers, you name it. This is just to make sure everybody knows what to expect and everybody knows what's going to be happening throughout the transaction. And it's a win-win for everybody. I really do believe that. We just have to make sure that we're following the right protocol. Let's see. We've got room. We got time for a couple more questions. Can a buyer pay their buyer's agent with seller concessions received from paragraph 12?
No, paragraph 12 has a definition. It's called seller pays buyer's expenses, and buyer's expenses is capitalized. So it is a defined term. And so, excuse me, in the contract, it defines what buyer's expenses means. And it's got a long list of stuff. Broker fees are not in there. So there's like a last line that gets people caught up. It says, or other expenses payable by buyer. And they go, oh, that means broker fees. No, it does not. It says other expenses payable by buyer under this contract. So you have to identify somewhere in the contract where it says buyer's broker fees, and it does not. In fact, paragraph 8 specifically says all obligations for broker compensation are contained in separate agreements. So the current version of the 1-to-4 contract does not have broker's fees, and paragraph 12 should not be used for broker fees. The addendum 2406, that last form that I showed, 2406 addendum regarding broker's fees, that has a line in there specifically for the seller saying, I will pay broker fees to the buyer.
Do you see any of this helping to bring any clarity to some of the conversations we often see on procuring cause?
I mean, I hope so. I hope that's like kind of one of the positive consequences is that we have to have more in-depth conversations about how compensation works. Offers of compensation on the MLS was just so easy. You put the number in there, you never even had to talk about it after that because the buyer's agent was just going to look on the MLS to see what it was. And then you submit the offer, you work the transaction. You mentioned about buyer's agent saying, oh, my services are free and you don't have to worry about paying me because the seller's going to pay me. And buyers buying a property, having a professional and not ever knowing that they had to pay that person or what that person was getting paid, or, you're doing all this work. Do I have to pay you? That's not okay. So hopefully the entire conversation about compensation, you first got to understand it on a deeper level so that you can then explain it and have the conversation with your client. So I think, procuring cause is wrapped up into that. I do want to say something. Make sure you understand the difference with procuring cause now versus before. Before, when the offer of compensation was on the MLS, you didn't have to sign anything. You could just show up and say, hey, I'm the procuring cause. You owe me money. Now, offer of compensation is not on the MLS anymore. You can't just show up and say, pay me. You first have to get that agreement signed. The listing broker has to first agree to pay you if you're the procuring cause, right? That happened automatically on the MLS. It's not automatic anymore. So you first have to get an agreement signed. We have 2402 compensation agreement between brokers, where that's what the listing broker is agreeing to. Once you sign that agreement, now you can say, I'm the procuring cause. You owe me compensation under our agreement. Big difference there.
Yeah, that is a big difference. And I think that does help I think that order helps bring some clarity, definitely. Mary, David, before we wrap up, do either of you have any parting thoughts or wisdom for our agents as we navigate all this?
Well, I'm going to go back and say, don't be the person with their head in the sand and wait for this to happen. Get involved and know what is happening. I mean, this is all starting in August, and 2 weeks right after it all starts, we have the state conference up at the Gaylord up in Dallas. You don't have to go the whole time, but you can go and you can find out what changes are happening, what things are happening legislative. Also, watch the TREC meetings, watch what's going on so you actually know what's happening rather than just, coming back and saying, well, I don't like the changes. And give your words. I mean, TREC, all the broker lawyer committee and all the committees look for stuff. I know Texas Realtors looks for remarks. So have a voice, and that's how we fix things, is to be involved in it rather than just complain about it.
I think my final remark, Shae, is something that you brought up in the beginning: workarounds. No workarounds, y'all. Because we not only have these are from the settlement from a lawsuit that NAR, spent millions of dollars on attorney's fees and expert witnesses, and NAR lost. Right. So we can have all sorts of thoughts about that. But in the end, NAR was about to have to pay $5 billion. And that was one lawsuit. There were several more down the line. On top of the lawsuit, we still have the Department of Justice is keeping a very close eye on the real estate industry. And they have flat out said publicly that they have concerns about workarounds, that they're not sure that the settlement is going to do enough, that it's going to work to stop what they consider, price fixing, steering, and all that. So they're still watching. Okay. So if we all sit here and we agree to the settlement and then workarounds are, become prevalent, guess what the DOJ does? They get busy again. And then the FTC is still out there. They have rulemaking authority. They might get involved. So it's really imperative for everybody. It's like, look, this is the new normal. These are our rules. Can you thrive under these new rules? Absolutely. We talk about brokers having more deeper conversations about fees and compensation. I know the great majority already are. I talk to so many brokers, they're like, oh, we already do that. Right. But for some, that's going to be a new thing. Have the deeper understanding so that you can have better conversations with your clients, know the rules, learn what the limitations are, and adapt, y'all. Brokers are entrepreneurs. You've got that spirit, that creativity. Use the creativity to adapt to the changing environment so you can thrive. Don't use the creativity for workarounds. Use it to adapt your business practices and your models and your marketing, and you will be just fine.
Shae, you're on mute.
Thank you both. I really appreciate everything for today. The time, the explanations, the answers. One of the things that I just want to say in parting to our agents as well is, really and truly, we've got two ways to react to this. We can be the co-creators of this new landscape together as we work to make this, like David said, thrive for us and figure out these new rules together, or we can resist it. I would love to see us be co-creators. I would love to see us engage this and really find ways for LPT to set the standard of how agents work these transactions. I would love for us to do that. And I've had so many conversations with so many of you that are so concerned about understanding all of this. And you've been here. You've been here for 2 hours today because you wanted to figure this out. And so we're going to let you go. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here, for being concerned, for wanting to elevate our industry, for wanting to do it right. We will be recording this. There are some questions we haven't gotten to, but as I was looking over those, I was realizing some of these, number one, we're going to have to get some policy clarifications on. But number two, a lot of these were similar questions. And I think it would best be served for us to put together like an FAQ. And this is going to be something that we're going to continue to add to as questions arise. But we're going to put together an FAQ. We're going to have that up by the end of this week. And we'll make sure that we get all this information out. Again, Mary, David, thank you so much. I really appreciate you both. And agents, thank you for joining us today. It's 11:55. We're going to let you have your day back with you. But stay tuned. We're going to be bringing more information about all this. We're going to be walking you through every one of these steps. Just hang in there. We're going to do this together. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.